Hello, my name is Grian, and today we're going to be building a waterfall house. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means we're going to be taking a bit of terrain, like this big cliff next to a river, and we're going to be adding our own waterfall along with a structure to go with it. You could obviously go for many styles, but this is the one that I've chosen for this video. So if you want to learn how to make it, let's get started. So obviously you need to choose a nice piece of terrain. This just happened to be next to a river, so it made more sense for the waterfall to flow out of it. You usually need to make a waterfall, or if you find one, they're not quite big enough. So you need to make a nice little hole at the top of the mountain and prepare an area for the water to fall down into. We all know that vanilla water is quite a difficult thing to work with. If you put a waterfall on the top of it as it stands, the water will just flow absolutely everywhere and make a huge mess, which is why we need to make our own custom cave and plunge pool where the water will meet the river. It's up to you what shape you want to make this cave. Pearl and I decided to make it nice and deep, but also really tall, and also have it try and meet the face of the mountain very gradually, so it really has a natural shape, but stands out as well. You could also in the future use this as your secret entrance. So you let the water fall down from the top, and if you want to add more shape, add single blocks to the water itself, just to expand it very steadily. If you add too many, you're going to create quite a mess. So that is our waterfall as it stands. Now it's time to do something with it. You could add some cobwebs at the bottom to add all of that mist if you wanted that effect. We're going to start by planning exactly where our water wheel is going to go. We're going to start with one to begin with and make sure it's an appropriate size for your build. You'll find out later on that this one was actually a bit too small and we decided to add a second one. Getting the shape is quite difficult, especially on a smaller size. While it's perfect all the way round, if you added lots of staircases to this, it would actually look more like an octagon, which we don't really want. So you have to try and use slabs and staircases to get just the right shape. If you're struggling to get a perfect circle, it might be a little bit too small. Try making the circle bigger. I added some slabs on the inside of a different colour to act as the runners for this water wheel. Obviously when the water goes over it, it isn't going to move, it's just for the aesthetic purposes. Speaking of which, you'll notice we actually built this without any contact to the water, so we're going to build a little aqueduct to force the water over the water wheel. This means that we can make the water wheel slightly to the side of the waterfall so that it doesn't obstruct the view once we zoom out a little bit. So let's now connect this water wheel to a building. This is a bit of a different style to what you're used to, as I always say to make a framework. However, this one is going to be made up entirely of the walls. This is for people that perhaps don't like as much heavy detail as I put on my buildings. So let's give this one a shot. You don't have to use stone, you could go for wood or perhaps something else, but stone is very readily available. So I want to point out what's going on here. We're making use of the space next to the waterfall, and of course that's going to vary depending on where your waterfall is. You'll see that the stone goes into the mountain. There's no dirt to stone connection, and that's very important, and they're very large, very tall blocks of stone that we're going to work with. On this particular outcrop, we're making a very tall roof to match the size of the building. It's quite important that you keep things in scale. If you did one of the normal cone roofs, it would look very out of place. So instead of having our normal framework, we are going to still have an overhang on this roof, but it will be separate to the roof, as I'll demonstrate later. It's made of different kinds of grey block so that it matches the stone. For the actual roof, we're making it one block smaller than the outcrop and the rest of the build, so it lines up perfectly, making the roof smaller than the actual build, which is quite an odd way to make it, but it is part of this unique style, and we're going to do this several times over, so hopefully you'll get the gist of things. You can decide to leave your roof straight, Or you can do what we're going to demonstrate here and make it curved if you're feeling a little bit more adventurous with your building. So we still have our overhangs, or in this case an inner hang, but then we take out the middle section to make it look like it's dipping down, and this gives it a sign of age because old buildings tend to have their roofs give a little bit. I want to separate the building entirely into these two segments, and this middle part can have the underneath taken out to make it form a bridge instead of its own separate building. This will give it a little bit more character. Obviously these are all options for you for your waterfall house. This second building is not as thin, there's a lot more space behind it. That's why we decided to turn the roof in a horizontal way so it's not on the front face. This is where you need to be careful where you orientate your roofs, because if I did make it front facing it would look extraordinarily large, and I do see people make that mistake quite often. So we're going to continue replicating what we did with the other build, just in a different orientation for the roof, making sure we've got that cobblestone overhang, and we make it 2 blocks thick on both sides, and we kind of rough it up a bit by adding some cracked stone brick, some slabs, and some staircases as well. And if you want to, like I did on the other one, you can make the roof have a lot more shape. You can tell that this looks quite a lot better. It is harder to do, however. I had some difficulty with the shape of this roof in particular to make it look good, and I had to do many alterations before I was happy with it. Making alterations on your build is completely normal and encouraged until you get the right shape, and we're going to do that on the other build as well, just so things remain consistent. I'd say go for one or the other, either have it completely straight if you're not comfortable with that design, or go for the more shaped ones if you're feeling adventurous. On the other side, where the water wheel enters our main building, I've just given it a highlight, a simple cobblestone ring to indicate where it goes in, and shows the fact that it will be rotating, even though it won't be rotating at all. It's just a nice little aesthetic design to make it seem more authentic. There usually is a hole where these supports go into in a water wheel house, or a mill, whatever you want to call it. So on this one, because we don't have any framework, we want to highlight the corners. Just changing those blocks to stone brick can really highlight the build a bit better. And for detailing, instead of highlighting the framework, we're going to add some more structures on the side. This is going to give it the depth that it lacks from not having a framework. So I've got this little segment that I've just literally stuck on the front of this build, and we're going to add another one on the side in a similar fashion. They are just simple boxes with some support structures underneath and not a lot of detailing on them. It's the overall shape that's going to make this build look good. And while the stone is our main block here, it is a bit plain. So by adding small percentages of other grey blocks such as the stone brick, both cracked and mossy, cobblestone, and even some andesite, we can make this look older and weathered at the same time. And I've also put in some staircases, as you know, to make it look a bit more detailed. The windows are just simple holes with some coal block behind them to make them look darkened and not a lot else. Unless you want to have a lot of interior, you could just block them up, or you could add some interior if you wanted to. There's also a balcony on this side. You can do all sorts of additions, such as the balcony and these little add-on buildings to add or retract space as you please. I also added some shape for the supports just to stylize it a bit more. There's so much flexibility with this build, both in the way you structure it, detail it, and in the way you texture it. But let's take a step back and have a look. That outcrop is now complete, but there's an imbalance in the build. Not only have we got space on the left hand side where there's no support for our water wheels, the small water wheel feature actually looks a bit too small now. So let's try and make a second one, but slightly larger to fill that space. So we're going to make it exactly the same way we made the first one, but again only bigger. So we're going to start off by making our cross section out of log, and to make a circle, it's easier to start off with a large square and try and get the shape of the curve correct before mimicking it on all 4 sides. You start with a full block, and then once you've got the shape that you're happy with, as you can see it took us a few times, you can then start adding the slabs and the staircase blocks. This one is a perfect circle, unlike the one above, because we didn't have to use the slabs to compensate for the size difference. So we need to replicate this on the other side as well, so that we can have 2 to put our little paddles in between. It's quite a simple thing to do, but it will take a little while to get the circle the right shape. It can be a bit frustrating at times, but give it a go. If you need to, copy the one that's there and make sure you've got a nice size that matches the rest of the build. Obviously that first one we made was a little bit too small. If I was going to make this again from scratch, I would actually make 1 larger wheel instead of 2 little ones. We then used a little aqueduct to channel some water over the second water wheel. But I did mess up, and it is quite devastating to get all of that water wrong, so try your best not to mess up and make the water go everywhere, because it can be very lengthy to clean up. Water is an absolute pain in Minecraft. So there's a few more bits to do that we're going to kind of speed through now that we've got the basics. We've got our 2 water wheels and we've done one part of the building. On this left side, we're going to replicate something similar to the first side, but we're going to make it a bit thicker at the bottom and add some different layers. So much like the first one, we're going to add some big stone blocks. The reason I didn't add this at the start was because I didn't realize how unbalanced the build would be when I first started making the blocks on the right. As you can tell, we've got 3 different layers to this bit, and each bit has a different roof style. Most importantly, they have a different orientation. The one at the front is sloping towards the build, and the others are the typical cone shape. Keeping some consistency throughout the build is quite important, making sure you keep the same overhang, the dipped roofs. You can mix and match styles, but I do prefer to keep things fairly consistent throughout. So we're just mimicking exactly what we did with the other build, the technique of making the blocks, making the roof, and then stylizing it with the inner framework, and then texturing that stone to be a bit more interesting. As you can see, things are starting to come together. We need to add those finishing touches, such as putting the cobblestone ring around that place where the water wheel enters the buildings. On the bottom one, you can see it actually enters through that hut, which we will fix a bit later on. The textures are all about 5% each, replace them with the stone, add some windows, and it's up to you whether you want to keep the interior or just black it out with some coal blocks. Everything is really starting to look nice now. We just need to finish up all of the other stuff on the far right hand side, just through the texturing and everything else, and we will be just about finished. So that's the building itself along with the water wheels. But what we can do now is just spruce up the surroundings. It's not a particularly attractive mountain in itself, but the build does seamlessly go with it. We can improve this by just integrating some terrain, particularly cobblestone, to give it a foundation, to make it look like it's actually standing on something solid rather than just dirt or sand or even water in the case of the river. Doing that all the way round really gives it that firm feeling, and it just helps the whole thing flow a lot nicer than having that really jagged 90-degree angles. We can then add loads of trees and some vines and all of our normal nature stuff to try and improve this build in general. Once we finish placing the final few trees, that's it. That is the entire water wheel house. Now obviously there's not an incredible amount of room on the interior, but the exterior is really something quite different to what we're used to. It's more of a stone water mill kind of thing going on, and it looks very old and traditional, and I really like the design, and I love it because it's got a lot of flexibility in it. You can have different shapes, different attachments, different shaped water wheels, all sorts of things that you can do here that could work out really nicely. Anyway, that's it from me. If you liked this style of commentary better, where you more watch what we're building and then I sort of commentate over some particular features, or if you'd prefer a more in-depth one, I'm also open to that. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to Pearlescent Moon for building this water wheel with me. It is a new year and I have lots of projects planned, so hopefully we can enjoy 2017 building lots of cool stuff. Goodbye!